My only aim is to take these big, difficult, scary, intimidating topics and to make them accessible. So the glass cliff is the topic of my third and most recent book, and really it's a conversation about what happens to underrepresented leaders when they manage to break through the glass ceiling. So most people have heard of the glass ceiling, that invisible but seemingly impossible to break through barrier that sits above the heads of women in business and stops them from reaching not only the pinnacles of, professional attainment, but also the peaks of their own personal capabilities, because they find themselves hitting their heads against this invisible but seemingly impossible to break through barrier that limits the trajectory of their progress. But we know that there are some people, some women, who manage to break through the glass ceiling. And so I wanted to look at what happens after that. And so that's the story of the glass cliff. And so the glass cliff was first discovered back in 2005 by two researchers from the University of Exeter. And they saw a piece on the front cover of the Times business section. And it had the headline, "Women on the Board, a Help or a Hindrance?" And it was written by a female journalist who said that when businesses appointed women to their most senior leadership roles, to CEO, to a member of the board, that those businesses seemed to suddenly be in a moment of trouble. And so she asserted that women on the board must in fact be bad for business, and businesses in the UK would be better off without them. So there were two researchers, and they saw this and they thought, that sounds weird. And so they researched. And what they found was that the beginning of the story was being lost. It wasn't being told. So instead of women coming in, taking over businesses, and those businesses suddenly starting to fail, what they found was a more interesting and more nuanced story. They found that those businesses that appointed women into leadership positions for the first time were, more often than not, already in periods of prolonged poor performance. And that poor performance could take all sorts of forms. It could look like a stock market hit. It could look like a reputational scandal. It could look like a hit to evaluation. Whatever that was, whatever form that took, the researchers found that those businesses that had been through some kind of internal crisis suddenly became much more likely to appoint a female leader. And so that's what the glass cliff looks at. So I'm not the researcher. I didn't do that original piece of research. I see my job, whether I'm talking about race or gender or work or whatever it is, my job is to read the long and difficult research papers that are behind the paywalls and to find interesting stories. And to find interesting stories that, because they are long and difficult and behind a paywall, they probably haven't been found or told or reached their place in a cultural conversation that they deserve. So my job is to find those pieces and then to give them language, to give them accessibility, to give them an audience. My work is taking these big, difficult, intimidating topics and breaking them down into bite-sized pieces that feel accessible and that feel interesting for normal people to engage with. So the glass cliff is the story of women's leadership journeys beyond the glass ceiling. And that can be difficult. That can be a story of a lack of internal resource, a story of a lack of internal support. It can be a story of a really short tenure or things going wrong that you don't understand. And so the glass cliff is a really important story to tell because it tells us what to look out for. It tells us what the warning signs are. Because not all women who step into senior leadership positions do face the risk of the glass cliff. There are 5 warning signs that you have to look out for. So through my discussions, we talk about what those warning signs are. We talk about how to address them when you're, considering a role that might face this. We talk about high profile examples of the glass cliff so we can pull cultural examples to illustrate the point. But really we're looking at those journeys into senior leadership positions, what to look out for and how to try to make them work as well as they can for you and for the women around you and those who come after you. Because once we can identify the glass cliff, we can start to challenge the circumstances that make it possible, and we can start to give all women better and fairer chances as they proceed through their own leadership journeys. It's a really strange time to be doing work in the area of DEI. This is a type of work that I first started doing in around 2020, when the conversation around the Black Lives Matter movement started to really gain traction. And we had all of these conversations like, this is a movement, it's not a moment. And, we were really excited and optimistic because we knew that this was not a new conversation, but we knew that suddenly people were interested and engaging and taking this conversation about race and diversity, equality and inclusion much more seriously than they had in the past, because these aren't new issues, these aren't new struggles. These are the same struggles that our parents and our grandparents and their parents have been dealing with and working around and fighting for generations. And so it really felt in 2020 that we might be reaching a tipping point of that conversation going mainstream and us making some progress. And I think it is fair to say that that conversation around DEI, around respect and inclusion did go quite mainstream, but it didn't necessarily have the positive impact that we might have hoped. And so at the moment, it's a really complicated, interesting, and I'll be honest, a bit of a confusing time to be working in this space. But as I say, these are the same fights that our parents and grandparents and their parents have been having and fighting for and working towards forever. Because one thing about equality, one thing about inclusion, one thing about all of this work is it was never going to be instantaneous. Changing hearts and minds and values and actions and big systemic ways of working was never going to be a one and done solution. It was never going to be a click your fingers and things get better. Whenever we make progress, there is always pushback. Whenever we take a step forward, there are always some people who are trying to pull us back. And so it can feel like a really difficult moment to have hope or to be optimistic or to feel like we're going in the right direction. But I think this is a hopeful moment because I think it has to be. Whenever people come and they try to undo the progress that we've made, whenever people come and they try to challenge our right to exist with freedom and safety, that's when we need people more than ever. That's when we need businesses to say, not us. Not in our name, not on our watch. We are still committed to this. We still care about this. This is still at the core of everything that we do and we believe in. And so it's a scary time. It's a confusing time. It's an intimidating time, but it's also a hopeful time because that hope is what is going to drive us and push us to continue to do that work and to take that action to undo, to work around, to be part of making the change that we all know, really. We all know that we need to make a change. And this is our opportunity to not shy away from that when it gets hard, but to double down, to say, this is what I believe, this is who I am, and this is what I stand for. So it can be a scary time, but it's also a time of great opportunity. And it's a great time for businesses to really reaffirm and re-solidify who they are, what they stand for, and where they want to put their investment, their time, their efforts, and their money. My approach to talking to businesses about the topics of race and gender are pretty much the same, regardless of who I'm speaking to. I've spoken alongside the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I've spoken alongside the Secretary of State for Health, I've spoken alongside the CEO of the NHS, I've gone into various governmental departments, I have been part of conversations from Fortune 500 companies to banks to charities to student unions to wherever I can get the message, I will try to take that message. But one important thing for me about that message is it doesn't really change. Whether you're speaking to a group of students in a university union who want to know how to be the best and most supportive person that they can be for their peers, or you're speaking to a group of Fortune 500 leaders or governmental leaders who want to know what the best approach is for raising difficult conversations in the spheres and the areas that they're working in, it is pretty much the same conversation. The ideas that we have been socialised with around race and gender and value, they don't really change depending on who you are. There's no reason to imagine that a CEO is better informed about the topic of discrimination or marginalisation than a entry-level intern who has lived experience of trying to move through the world whilst being marginalised in some way themselves. And so the work that I do, the approach that I do doesn't really change. My aim for every session is to make people laugh. My aim for every session is to make people feel empowered. My aim for every session is to give people a really clear idea of where we are, what the situation is as we find it. And then I do try to give actionable, tangible tips and advice that people can take to feel empowered and to make change on their own terms. And sometimes that advice will change. The things that a CEO or a board member is empowered to do are obviously different to the things that someone attending a talk at a student union can do in that moment. But at some point, that person who is in a student union, who is studying, who is learning, who is engaged in this topic, they're going to become the CEO. They're going to become the intern. They're going to have all of these touch points. And so the information that I share, it's really not level specific. It's just about, here is where we are. Here is what we can all do. Some of the takeaways will be things that you can do now. Some of them will be things that you can do later. Some of them will be things that you hadn't thought about that you can now talk to the people above you about. So what I'm trying to say is there is no great change in how I approach these conversations, depending on who I am speaking to. My only aim is to take these big, difficult, scary, intimidating topics and to make them accessible, to make them interesting, to make you laugh while you're engaging with them. No one's telling you off. We're just telling you what's going on. And then we're giving you the tools to be part of making that different and better for everyone. I've been doing this work for several years now, and I've gone into so many businesses, charities, organisations, student groups, whatever it is, and I've spoken to thousands of people at this point, from governmental officials to people just at the very beginnings of their engagement and discussion with this topic. And my aim for what I want people to feel is always the same. I want them to feel hopeful. I want them to feel informed. I want them to have a good understanding of where we're starting and why this matters. I want them to have a feeling of accessibility. So one of the problems I think in this area is we can use really big words and we don't give people a chance to understand what they mean. Because the words in the topic of race, the words in the topic of equality, of inclusion, they can be quite complicated and they can also change quite quickly. What might have been acceptable to say 5, 10, 15 years ago probably needs a tweak, probably needs a rethink now. And so I spend some time trying to break down those initial barriers to entry. I talk about the words and what they mean. I talk about where we are now, and I talk about where we want to get to. I talk about what we've won and what we've lost and what's at risk and where we are going together. So I really hope, and from having spoken to thousands of people, I feel confident in saying I know that people leave the sessions that I run feeling hopeful. They leave the sessions that I run feeling empowered. They leave the sessions that I run feeling that they have a better grasp of not only the stats and the facts and the percentages of where we are and where we need to be, but also language that they can use to have those difficult conversations, to stand up for themselves, to stand up for each other, and to say, this is what I believe, this is what I stand for, and this is what I will tolerate and what I won't. So I hope people leave feeling that it's been fun. And that can be really difficult because often people are brought to sessions like this as a mandatory session. And so it can be sometimes a little bit of a difficult audience to win over. We can have some people who feel hostile or annoyed that they've had to be part of this conversation. So I really try to meet people where they are. I try to make a fun and engaging session. And because that's how I think, I try to back everything with data. So I hope people leave feeling engaged. I hope people leave feeling informed. I hope people leave feeling empowered. And I hope people leave feeling that they can do a little bit more than they could have done before. I hope people leave feeling a little bit braver, a little bit bolder, and a little bit more ready to face the hard things that we have to talk about, and to know that they don't have to be hard or scary or difficult or upsetting conversations, but to know that they can be fun and they can be interesting and they can be authentic, and that you can get things wrong. And as long as you're not repeating that mistake time and time again, that's okay. Because we all have to learn, we all have to grow, we all have to be part of that support system for each other. And I hope people leave feeling as though I have now become a part of that support system for them.